justice and the law. She's currently serving as the president of the Achva Academy College of Science and Education in Israel. She previously served as an associate professor at the Spriggs Law School, College of Management, and had a visiting appointment at NYU, and sort of looking at transnational law at Peking University. Okay, we'll go on. She, most importantly, I think for relevant today, she's a co-founder and chair of TURA, the Israeli Center for Equality, where she has dealt with issues of, I guess, primarily of October the 7th, and women's issues, and violence against women, and the silence of the international community on these issues. And really has been at the forefront of putting these issues on the map, nationally and internationally. So today she's going to speak about Hamas's October 7th weaponization of sexual atrocities, seeing the victims through the chaos of terror. So thank you for being with us. And the last time we were together, she got her tenure when we were in London.
I became a full professor. So yeah, but definitely a type of tenureship in terms of in the professor's world. So thank you very much for this introduction and for this seminar and for this invitation, my dear colleague Charles. Really, the initiatives that ISGAP is leading have been, you know, important and relevant throughout time, but definitely became of specific importance ever since the October 7th attack. So, as Charles said, as being a feminist scholar and activist, like I'm a law professor, but I was also working in the field, in the activist feminist field in Israel. I initiated an NGO called Tmura, where we fought for women's equality, mainly women, but not only, and mainly through the lens of fighting sexual violence, establishing the legal apparatus of providing compensation for victims of sexual assaults and gender-based violence, which was something that was not very, not was common at all in the Israeli legal system. We know that criminal legal systems were always at the part of the combat against violence against women, but not the civil system part of the law. And I'm very proud in this work that I've been doing there. And I'm giving this introduction as it has a lot of bearing to the way I looked at what has happened on October 7th. So what I'm going to present here is actually like a part of the extensive work that I've been leading alongside other research team, including these three researchers named on the right-hand side in the bottom, that is manifested mainly through an extensive report that we wrote titled "The Challenges in Identifying and Documenting Sexual Crimes Committed During a Raid Terrorist Attack." The report has been issued on November 2024, which was around a year after October 7th, and it was presented in the UN and ignited a lot of interest in what we had to say, which might come across as a bit surprising looking at the silence, somewhat, or even to an extent, the denial that we experience when it comes to the sexual assaults. And I think that there's a reason a reason why this report more specifically was able to break through these walls of denialism and silencing. So let's look at the work that was produced there and look at the subtitle of Lessons for Global Preparedness. So when I think of this initiative, I see it as part of my work as a feminist, and I perceive myself, even after October 7th, with a lot of, reservations and critical thinking that still needs to be done, and is an ongoing process that we're going through as a community. I see myself still as a part of the feminist global community, and I consider this work, and I know that it is relevant to all, to the security of women throughout the world, and not just relating to October 7th or to Jewish women or Israeli women. So starting with my report was important to me, for me to take it from a point of no need to prove what has been determined to have happened. And it's a stance to take. And many of the works that were done around October 7th sexual violence are still, in a way, I find them to be somewhat apologetic. They're going back to the point of were there not attacks, and claiming that there were, these sexual crimes were committed, and only from there taking it forward. And what we have already in place is a few records that state and determine that these crimes were actually happening and committed against civilians in Israel on October 7th. And one of the most important and prominent such a recognition comes from the visit of Ms. Pramila Patton, who is the rapporteur for sexual violence under conflict in areas of conflict from the UN. She was visiting Israel in January. It took a while before the UN started, taking seriously our contentions that this has happened. And you have to understand that in this respect, of course, there are all kinds of, diplomatic issues and ways by which the process gets started. But at the same time, I think it took us less than a week to approach U.S. women, a group of feminist activists. Most of us, by the way, were with a legal background, writing to UN women, asking them to condemn what happened, to recognize that this has happened. We were not even referring yet to the condemnation and who should be condemned, just to recognize that this has happened as a matter of basic, moral stance on the issue, providing the most minimal relief that the victims warranted and we as women asked for. And on December, it was only by the beginning of December that the Israeli mission to the UN has organized independently, and despite this, deafening silence from UN organizations, human rights, women's organizations, silence, they organized against this backdrop an independent event that I had the privilege of attending as someone who was involved, from the very beginning in documenting and bringing to the light the fact that these atrocities were committed. And it was the beginning of December, and that was the first time, like 2 days before this event took place, the UN women issued some kind of very dull statement about how worried they are about women's safety, both in Israel and in Palestine, of course. And then in January, she comes to Israel, she arrives to Israel with a mission to, in a way, inquire, not investigate, but rather inquire. Everything is very careful, very softly put, to inquire the events regarding sexual violence. And as you can see in the bottom, she was also visiting the occupied West Bank. Otherwise, you cannot touch upon an issue of this magnitude that is pertaining to the suffering of women in Israel alone. So I'm all for always looking at all women's safety and rights, and right not to be sexually attacked. But the fact that most of the report was actually meant to explore what has happened in Israel, and then the need to put in this one line there makes it, I think, insulting in many ways, also for Palestinian women in that respect. But what I'm more interested in is looking at what I colored here in the report. The report was issued in March. It was a very important report in the sense that the statement was very clear, and the assertion was that mass and systematic cases of rape, gang rape, and other sexual violence were perpetrated against women, mainly women, predominantly women and girls in Israel, even though also some men were sexually assaulted as well. And in a way, we were just, this group just heard a talk about how we can see everything that happened on October 7th in the history of the pogroms and atrocities and persecutions held against Jews throughout history. But in modern time, we have not witnessed anything of this type. We wouldn't have imagined that something like this could happen. And in a way, the whole world would not have imagined that something like this could happen to Israeli women on an Israeli soil. And this is why I think that the singularity of what was happening required some contextualization of what was happening. Because if you look at the intersection or the interrelation between sexual violence, war, weaponization of women's bodies, this has always been the case, since the dawn of history. So in that respect, there was nothing new about that. So we were always trying to hold the fact that this is something that happens to women in such situations, but at the same time, this has never happened before. You would not have imagined that this could happen here, and this is a gap that needs to be bridged somehow within the minds of everyone, including the minds of authorities in Israel as well. We were not just dealing with denial coming from outside. There was an inner denial that was motivated, by other rationals. The inability to comprehend that something like this has happened to us was something that we needed to fight with inside Israel as well. But of course, the motivations are very different. But there was a gap here that I immediately captured as important to to put a light on. And why is that? Because gaps, maybe, Charles, ISGAP, maybe these gaps, these are the places where anti-Semitism can get into motion in the most uninterrupted manner. Like, these are the Israelis with their, this is a whole new level of victimhood, of victim playing cards by Israelis. It is impossible now to imagine that Israeli women were attacked as if we are here in, I don't know, excuse me for saying this, Nigeria or Syria or, Iraq, attacked by savages such as, with no one to protect them. So this is why immediately that, I think, inflames the ideas of some kind of Israeli propaganda. And that's why we need to recognize these gaps and to fill them with knowledge, that is based on expertise. And if it's a legal expertise, it's even better. It's very structured, very organized, and that's a way for you to explain why this gap exists, and to just block all kind of politicization of these gaps. So when Patton came to Israel, and she was absolutely, horrified with what happened here. She was on the mission to unveil the truth as to what has happened, and I was invited to her first, the first reception held in her honor, and the first sentence that she put in the room was, "I call upon the victims to come forward, not to be shy, not to be intimidated." And I was like, the victims are mostly murdered. This was a terrorist attack. Okay, this is not an ongoing war. We're not in Ukraine. We're not in, in a no man's land of the type that we see in Iraq or places like these where terrorist organizations roam the territories, go back and forth. No, this is a one-timer, a raid terrorist attack. And for a one day, or even in a way, the concise impact was for half a day of a terrorist attack. You do not expect to see a trail of victims coming forward and telling you what happened. This is where I thought that what we need to do is to contextualize the specific singular characteristics of this attack as a first time in modern history when something like this happens. And that would set the ground to explaining how such mechanisms work in a manner that leads to the fact that we have very few evidence available, definitely given the systematic mass atrocities, sexual atrocities that were committed against civilians. And this is where she has put it. That's why I dedicated the 3-hour meeting that I had with Patton and her team to that only. Like, I could, share evidence. It was the beginning. I was looking together with the other colleagues to evidence that were coming to us, getting to us, and so on and so forth. But that was not the case with me. I decided to dedicate our meeting for that. And later on, when I saw that she just mentioned it, in a half a page, my mission was to just, put it under the light and see exactly what the challenge is in providing evidence to something that you claim has happened to you when we're discussing a sexual attack and a terrorist attack. Okay, and that was the report that we provided. And what we were looking for in the report is to provide both, you know, on the victims' level, to be able to speak on their behalf. The fact that they're not here could not be a reason to not hearing their voices, to denying what they've been through because of this specific case where the mass victims are being actually murdered and silenced forever. They need to have recognition. It's not just them, they're not here, but their families, others who witnessed, who know that this has happened. In a way, the whole people in Israel needed this recognition. Again, as I said, both for the inside and for the outside. We needed mechanisms to start working and operating in Israel itself. Because, for example, one of the immediate effects were that many past or prior victims of sexual assaults in Israel were experiencing triggers. So the state needed, or the government needed, to provide special assistance to these people, and so on and so forth. We have a lot of the statistics shown by the rape crisis centers, that this is one of the experiences that we had, and there are many others. So on the national level, we need to have the state respond in a proper manner to the needs of the community in general, and of course on the international level, the acknowledging that even under such circumstance, there is from now on, in many respects, we're opening like a new era, God help us, for such type of terrorist attacks happening on super nations, completely democratic, liberal, strong nations' soil. That's the new thing. This is something that has not happened before for a one-timer type of attack. And this is something that we're going to see in the future, because unfortunately Israel has been the bedrock of you know, innovation, unfortunately, in terrorist tactics that are spreading like a disease. Right after we've seen it in Israel, these are terrorist experts, counterterrorism experts, have been providing this type of insight to the work we've been doing. We're not experts on counterterrorism now more than before we started this, but I've been, you know, approaching experts, one of the greatest experts in the world on that issue, Professor Boaz Garnaut from the Reichman University, has been working very closely with me on this part of the report, and we're expecting to see all kind of terrorist organizations and groups copying this type of behavior. Think of, for example, if you recall, in Vienna there was supposed to be a concert by Taylor Swift last summer, just a year ago, and it was canceled. And it has been canceled after the intelligence in Austria or in Belgium, sorry, was able to intercept all kind of correspondences between terrorists, young jihadi terrorists, speaking about the concert and mentioning the fact that there are young women there, young girls, and that it's going to be highly beneficial and effective if they attack. And they decided to cancel the concert. Now, interestingly, when I spoke to a counterterrorism expert on these talks, he told me that that he analyzed all of the conversations that were going back and forth there. He had access to these communications, and after he heard my talk, he said, I never thought of it this way. My thought was that it could be highly effective because Taylor Swift is so, prominently known, and her femininity is celebrated. So maybe that's a way to harm her ideology. And I said, maybe, but it could definitely be also that there are many girls, by the way, alone in coming to these concerts. I can tell you that my daughter was attending the concert that was just 2 days before the one that was canceled in Amsterdam with her girlfriend. Like, both of them, are less than 18, and they're alone there, alone in the sense. Well, they're Swifties, whatever. Yes. So what we were doing was to ask ourselves, if this is where we're headed, and this is what happened to us, then we need to look at the systematic manner in which the loss of evidence as to the commission, execution of sexual crimes can be done in such cases. And what we aimed at achieving by that was first to just lift this cloud of not even of denialism. Those who deny it, I don't really care about them, and they're really actually a minority of people. But those who don't understand how this is really possible, that you don't have evidence, those who question. Not necessarily anti-Semites, but they would cling to anti-Semitic propaganda if they don't have anything else to cling to. So what we wanted to do was to make sure that they understand how the evidence got lost, and that October 7th happened, and that the sexual crimes were committed to the a horrifying extent that we contended that they were, establishing, crimes against humanity, and to an extent even a type of a genocide through the weaponization of women's body. And the second goal was to use our horrible example and case as a test case, as something from which we can all learn, as a warning sign for other countries to be better prepared. So what we did was to map all the first and secondary responders that could have had access to the evidence in the field, and to interview them. We interviewed over 40 of such first responders. We collected their testimonies and analyzed it. And you have to understand that even, that was done in the very first month, like I think it was from January to August, something like that, in 2024. Many of them were still in reserve service. Some of them were unavailable for being so traumatized with what has happened. Some of them wanted to speak to us, but were not available physically, and only later on. So it took a while for us, but what was amazing was to learn how for many of them, it was the first time ever to speak to someone who asked them, how was it for you? What did you do there? What did you see? What have you encountered when you went into the house, into the fields of the Nova Party, and so on and so forth? So we were taking these testimonies, and we proposed a new paradigm that actually contends that under a terrorist attack of the type that we're talking about, which is a raid terrorist attack, a very intensive and concentrated one. The chaos is so overwhelming that it destroys the ability of any investigative and legal system to be able to collect evidence, but even before that, of the relevant first responders to identify that something like this has happened. And that's why we went forward to offer recommendations and best practices to avoid such an outcome in the future. So as I said, what we were referring to as a singular case and the first time ever to have happened is the case of a raid terror attack, where you have an overwhelming domination on civilians that is very surprising, that is not expected. So you create a complete chaos, and that leads to a severe loss of evidence. And this is something that happens on a state that has, normally has complete control over the relevant territory. And even though it is very peculiar, it is still something that we contend that if happened to us, could happen to you too. We have looked into other experiences, of course, and we see how our work can shed light on being more effective even under such, in cases where this is not a one-timer type of terrorist attack. But still, as I told you before, we think that this is where the world is going, the Western world in this respect, is going with terrorist enclaves and small groups that can do something of this type. So what are the investigative challenges? I think most of them can be very easily and intuitively understood, but it was important for me and for the group, again, as legal thinkers, to put it into a systematic, a very academically organized, elements that can be pointed to and can be shown in a way that proves that it is indeed almost impossible to think that you would be able to somehow obtain evidence under such circumstance. So in many of the cases, we think of October 7th, but for those of us who come from the field more, who were more connected to what was happening, it took almost 3 days before Israel was able to gain full dominance again on the envelope little cities and villages. I don't know if you're aware of that. That was not just really the case of October 7th, half a day, they went back, some of them were chased back and to Gaza, and that was it. 3 days of very intensive combat zone. And in terms of collecting evidence, it is in many respects not just forever in terms of time, but also in terms of contaminating the evidence and the crime scenes. But in this case, there were other important problems as well, or significant problems. There was the fear of body abductions. So many of the bodies were just, dead bodies were just taken very swiftly, thrown, I'm sorry for the language, but this is like I'm quoting from in the report that we made, we have a lot of quotes from the interviews that we made. So bodies were taken, thrown into a truck, thrown into a truck, and the truck was leaving to take them to a place where they could all be held under the control of the IDF. So, this is not a way to look at a crime scene yet again. Of course, very little number of survivors, and the survivors who were left, who managed to survive such the crimes, not just the sexual crimes, but also the terrorist attack, were with extreme trauma, also with responders. Many of them that we approached told us that they are unable yet to get back to what they saw. Some of them we started interviewing and they stopped in the middle and said they're not able to go on with it. Of course, again, the overwhelming number of unidentified victims, we're talking here about, think of the Nova Festival, for example. Many families didn't even know that their loved ones are even there. This is an open criminal scene that is impossible to work with in that respect. So the need to identify the really hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bodies that were unidentifiable, and the fact that families were pressuring the government to provide identification as to whether their loved ones were alive or not, this has taken all the efforts towards identification. This would happen anywhere, by the way. Like, identification way before looking at the reason for death or other crimes that were perpetrated against the corpse of the person, and so on and so forth. And in this respect, some of the CSI personnel, like crime scene experts or investigative experts that we were talking to, said that all that we cared about was to identify people and to determine their death, and that was like we didn't have the luxury of looking at other things that were done to them. So most of the evidence in such cases for sexual assaults are carried on the body, and if the body is not being forensically explored, then it is impossible to think of getting or retrieving the evidence that are normally expected to be found under such crimes. And in many of the cases, there was not even awareness, no tools for those who thought they were seeing something that looked like again, I'm quoting from people, mainly all kind of religious, the Zaka organization volunteers, all these volunteers who come to to terrorist attack arenas and collect body parts to, particles, even maybe it's more correct, and have zero knowledge in forensic science of any type. So some of them could maybe think that this is what they were saying, but then it's not acceptable to take a picture now of what has happened. This has happened on Shabbat and Chag. They have, even though in Zaka they already had a rabbinical authority to work on Shabbat and to do whatever it takes to save life, they didn't perceive it as life-saving actions, so most of them did not even pull out their telephones. Many of them don't have a cellular phone, but rather what we call in Israel, stupid phone, that it doesn't have a camera because it's not kosher, and so on and so forth. So we have a singularity of these crimes vis-a-vis others, because again, another main contention is, but how is it possible that these crimes were not were not, being streamlined. There are no pictures, not any bragging of the terrorists about it, and so on and so forth. Just the way they did with other crimes. So, like, we know that other horrible, horrifying, heinous crimes ever imagined were happening. And these crimes we know to detect. So how come we cannot do it when it comes to sexual crimes? So this is where the singularity of sexual crimes is coming into play. And of course, there are many reasons that led to these, to the relative concealment of these crimes, sometimes coming from the people themselves. I can tell you that just a month ago, my team has been approached by a survivor of the Nova Festival who said she wants to speak to us about a sexual crime that she's been going through. And it was a month ago, and we're still trying to set a meeting with her. Like, this is how scarce and meager and very little the motivation and the ability to speak to us or to any of the investigative bodies is. And if we go back here, to the feminist critical work on how investigative bodies are working when it comes to rape and so on and so forth, this is relevant also here. We wouldn't have imagined, this is something that surprised me. And I have to say, it caught me by surprise. I thought that here we will be encountering a different approach to what we were bringing to the fore, but it was not that different. And again, one of the CSI commanders that we spoke to is very highly ranked. He was pretty much in charge of what the CSI unit was doing at the time, said, you know what, with all due respect, last in line is the relevance of rape here. So identification comes first, and there's no real relevance to the question of whether she was raped or not. And I don't want to add sorrow to her parents. I don't want, like, these were sentences that we heard from ultra professional, officials. So again, it was the investigating these crimes was was marginalized, but again, not from some kind of vicious denial, but rather for other important reasons. We've been looking at examples of sexual violence of all type that we were able to identify throughout our work. But I think what is most important is that we have been coming to utilize a new notion in our work that is more efficient and relevant, I think, to a battlefield of this type, which is to not look for evidence, but rather to look for indications. So indications are, I don't want to get into the tiny details of legal definitions, but in a way, indications are softer than evidence in what they require. And what I want them to do is to, once they appear, to enable recognition first, and then we'll talk about legal accountability later on, because we know that in reality there is almost a de facto impunity when it comes to sexual crimes everywhere, by the way, not just regarding the Hamas. And with Hamas, there's a really challenging and problematic barriers to taking these people, these animal people type of, to the courts in Israel. So I'm putting this aside, but I'm just mentioning that it's a whole new and separate complexity. But even if we don't look at what happens in Israel, under international law, it's very hard to establish accountability for sexual crimes. And I think that in that respect, we have like this vacuum between the time that the crime has been committed and 20 years later, if you manage to get a conviction, and there has to be a recognition in between. And this is something that we should bring to the fore with regards to what happened to us. So the indications are, for example, handcuffing of leg or leg cuffing that were identified in many of the female victims. Why would you need something like that in a terrorist attack zone, as opposed to in a, when someone enters a woman's house and they tie her up, and it makes horrible sense, but it makes sense, okay, as opposed to a terrorist attack. Bodies that were positioned in ways or were shot in a body posture that might indicate that there has been a sexual assault prior to the execution. So there are indications. You don't have to have evidence. And why are we allowed to use the indications alone? First, because it's only for recognition, not for legal accountability. And secondary, because we are dealing with terror, and this is a way for us to say the onus is on you to prove differently, because you caused the chaos that makes it impossible for the state to use and utilize its normally functioning mechanisms of investigation and so on and so forth, and to establish the criminality of what has happened. So let me give you an example of such an indication. This is a very light indication, but I think it's a strong one in the sense that this is a picture taken from the 232 route, where most of the people from the Nova Festival were escaping. Okay, some of them by foot, some of them in their cars. And it was not a picture, it doesn't look like that. The picture this is an enlargement of the picture to a very substantial extent. This is something that me and my team were able to suddenly spot in one of the endless pictures that we were looking at. And it's interesting because the photographer who provided us with all the pictures, whom we asked, did you get to see something odd that you have appear in your pictures or something like that? And he said, no, nothing I know. And we asked for his his file, and he just threw at us like 10,000 pictures, and somehow one of us just spotted that, and we enlarged it, and we saw this in the middle of nowhere on the ground. Why is it there? Like, a bottle of water makes sense. They were escaping, they were holding, to water that they had with them. Why would you get rid of your bra in the middle of this escape route? And then later on, we heard another testimony from a very high command woman that was in the field at that time. And again, when we approached her first, we approached her just because she got some distinction me and her got a distinction at the same event. And when I realized that she was there on October 7th, I just asked to speak to her after the event was finished. And we sat together, and she heard what I got the distinction for, and she said, yeah, but I don't have anything to tell you about this because I haven't seen anyone being raped. And I said, yeah, this is not what I'm looking for. It was not the same type of lecture that I gave. And I said, did you see something out of the ordinary that maybe, you know, just out of the ordinary, not something that is indicative of rape now? She said, you know what? I recall seeing many panties thrown along the road of the 232 route. And I was like, unbelievable. And I said, and what did you think? Like, panties. And she says, actually, I didn't think. Now that you mention something out of the ordinary, it got me thinking. So this is just, you know, one example. There are others, and I can maybe provide more examples later on. But I wanna finish with just saying that what we did was, and I think that this should be the next level of work to develop here, and I'm working on something of this type right now, is to have some kind of a manual toolkit, I don't know, like something that would provide the best practices and means for first responders to be able to address the issue of both the identification of indications and the collecting of evidence that is possible under these circumstances. And there are many ways that in which this could be so much better done than it was than it has been handled in by Israeli response forces. But I want to be very clear about it. We issued the report with an acknowledgement in the first page. The first acknowledgement was I dedicated this work to the victims of the sexual violence whose voice has been taken along with their everything. The second was to my two brothers-in-law who I've lost on October 7th when they were fighting on Israeli soil to protect civilian lives. One in the battle on Sderot, his name was Chen Nachmias. The second in the battle in Re'ib, in Kibbutz Re'im, his name was Ro'i Levi. Both of them were really moral, peace-thriving heroes, parents to 4 and 5 kids, who I miss tremendously. And I think that, we all lost amazing people and strategic assets for both Israel and the Jewish people, the way I look at it. And the third dedication was to the first responders who were rushing to the scenes, who have endured such immense pain in trying to either save lives or save what was left of the dignity and the integrity of people that was taken on October 7th. So I have zero criticism of how they acted, but I definitely think that we should still look at what has happened as a means to create better setting for other cases to come, and hopefully not to us. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's powerful and vital work, so thank you for all you're doing. So we have time for Q&A. Comments, questions?
Yifat a long time ago, so we already spoke about the project. It's not questions because I've already talked about it with the fact, but maybe you will respond. I think one of the things, you mentioned it, is the fact that there were also men there that were sexually violated. And I have some also experts in sexual violence, and I have some projects now, new projects on sexual violence against men. And this is another layer of silencing, because men, to start with, you know, it is a very invisible phenomenon, sexual violence of men in general, not in relation to this atrocity on October 7th. And in that sense, it's going to be, I mean, it's not going to be, it's another layer of silencing, it's another layer of invisibility. I don't think you would be able to even have people who will speak about it. So just to put it out there, because this was also not fascinating, because it's not the right word, but when we talk about sexual violence during war, we usually focus on women, because women are the main target of sexual violence during war, and not just, you know, in October 7th. And men usually kind of not part of, when we're not part of this discussion, and here we witnessed, we heard, and your project, of course, documented it, some sexual violated victims, male victims. So this just to put it out there. And I think one of the things that is Israel... This is why it's so genocidal, I think, in a way, that many of the men that were sexually violated were shot in their genitals. So I think that was very intended to not just humiliate, but also to project a message of not having men, you know, fertile other women. On the, you know, the breaking the masculinity, and, you know, the manhood, particularly the Israeli manhood. So this is one thing.
And I think in some wars with Israel, historically, there's been castration and different acts of violence against Israeli male soldiers' bodies. Historically, there's a history of that.
And one thought that I was like, I have never thought about it until I was in this 2 weeks workshop, and I guess it's the different perception of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that Israeli people have comparing to, you know, Jewish in the diaspora. That the scholarship on sexual violence perceive and conceptualize sexual violence as part of a power relation. It reflects, McKinnon was the first to conceptualize this. And for many in there, and it's not an excuse, of course, for the silence, the horrible silence of women's organizations in the United Nations, which there's a feminist, I think I talked to Amy back then. It was so, it felt like it still feels like a betrayal. I think Israel is perceived as so strong, you know, Palestinians are the weak, and, you know, marginalized. It was, I think, often, of course, it's anti-Semitic, but, you know, and has to do with it. But it was, I think, kind of confused many people. How are these, you know, weak and marginalized Palestinians do these, you know, sexually violent crimes against these strong Israelis? It's kind of, it, you know, confuses. It just unpack and, you know, break all the conceptualization of what is sexual violence, you know, part of power relations. And I think as Israelis, we didn't think about it. And I think for many of the Jewish people here that, you know, live outside of Israel, it's very, like, it's very clear. As this is another comment that I want to mention.
Anthony.
Thank you so much. Just two questions. One in relation to that problem of the international community and particularly feminist organisations not really processing this. I know that there was another report by the Dina Project, I think, recently that came out that seemed to get some cut through. What is being done to actually try and have that conversation in a meaningful way and maybe try and change the narrative, if anything, because I think it's very important to focus on telling that story properly with the people whose job it is to care about these kinds of things. Number two, what is being done, or in the report and in the work that you're doing, it seems to me and to maybe some others that I've spoken to over the last 2 weeks and really since October 7th, that there is something innate in the Islamist kind of ideology that motivated the attack, and that all of the attackers were, you know, inspired by, that uses sexual violence as a form of motivation and a form of message act, as you mentioned. What is being done to actually tie the acts that you are finding evidence for, even if it doesn't meet evidentiary burdens, to that ideology in a way that is intelligible for people outside of Israel? Because I think we've seen the use of sexual violence in places like Cologne and the Rotherham gangs in this country, and there is a growing narrative in some circles about how we need to discuss that link that I think would be really useful to explore in your work.
Yeah, so for the first question you asked, I think that, this is like another layer of endeavor that we had to take, not just to have our work completed in our circles, but rather to try and engage other organizations with this type of work. I've been very much concentrated on such endeavors, and like in a year from now, maybe the next seminar, I'll be able to hopefully convey good news about that. And I think the reason that this is becoming possible in a way, hopefully, and I think it is, I'm being very careful here, is that you need to have this, for us to take a deep breath and, not to think of how could you not be part of it in the past? How could you wait for us until now to be able to listen to us? But rather to put it aside and say, this is not what's important. As I said before, in that respect, maybe the anti-Semitic sentiment that drove this is not what I should be focusing on, but rather keep it professional, keep it relevant to them as well, and that makes it possible to do. And the underpinning premise of that would be the acknowledgement that this has happened and that they see themselves responsible to fixing that for the future. So in that respect, I think this is maybe a soft type of collaboration, but it's a good one, it's a solid one. And as for your second question, I know you're talking about the Rotherham gangs and things that happen here. I think it has a lot to do with the jihadi ideology that the terrorists, the Hamas terrorists, were driven by, but to now try and tie it to that would not, like, I'm talking about not about the analysis, but rather the whether it's smart or not to do it, whether it's going to be beneficial. I think it would not, because they would always say, how can you even compare? And I know exactly what you refer to, and I think that this is why my comment for the last session was that I'm not sure that what we're seeing here is a continuum from the pogroms, where this has been used, sexual crimes were used as well, but rather to what we see in ISIS and what we see now in Syria happening. And by the way, I'm a part of an initiative now of women in Israel trying to assist these women in Syria, and we see the world, again, very silent about what's happening there. And these are the same practices, so it's not necessarily something that you do to Jewish people, Jewish women, but rather something that as a jihadi, you do to women.
That's the problem is we get pushback from people saying that it's an act of decolonization, and for us to fight this battle, it's a very useful piece of evidence. Like, that's the link.
Yeah, but then you can, the colonization of of the Yazidi women in Iraq or of the Druze women in Syria. This should be the answer to this type of saying.
So a quick question. Do you look at the ideology of political Islam in your work? Because there are rules of war. And once you capture land, you have a right to the bounty, to property, and to women. Do you look at this ideology and its impact on this whole balagan?
I think it's a balagan in the sense that if we look at modern Palestinian terrorism, we don't see this. We don't see this very evidently. But so the question is, like, was it now different because they were able to conquer the land, even if for a day? Or is it like, we're not sure about that. This is the first time that something of this type is happening on such scales. Of course, there were incidents here and there. The recent case of Ori Ansbecher in near Jerusalem. So, of course, it has been practiced here and there. But the way we see it now as something that could be emanating from what you point to, the politics of it, is something that is very new to us. I was not looking in this direction yet.
Because I think there may be a difference between Fatah and
Hamas?
Hamas and Islamic Jihad. We should look in. I think it's worth looking into. In my humble opinion.
The focus, I think, is more women.
Where's the microphone, man?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I didn't hear what you said.
No, I'm just saying that sexual violence is a weapon of war, and even with the uniqueness maybe here because they came into Israel and it's not within war and but within an attack. Maybe it's more women-centered, not just Jewish. I mean, Jewish mixed with women, but it's not the first. Unfortunately, not the last time that sexual violence will be a weapon of war.
I'm referring more to the ideology of the soldiers, of people who invaded. I think they have a different ideology than Fatah. And is that, I don't know, is that...
Could be the case.
Is that, and does that
It's
impact the reality?
It's not a zero-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game. There could be like pluralist approach to these atrocities. So it's not a zero-sum game. What you say is clearly right. But then what are the motivations?
Chloe.
It could be that there's another religious type of political and religious and jihadi motivation to that, of course. Chloe,
then Amy, then Rona. Work our way back.
Firstly, thank you so much for your work. It's so horrible, it's so thankless, and that's why it's so important, so thank you. I work on the relationship between anti-Semitism and rape denial. And one thing that I've been very surprised about in my current research is actually the level of very detailed knowledge that people possess and, I would argue, weaponize in order to deny accounts that prove unequivocally that sexual assault was committed on the 7th of October. And in fact, using certain reports and the shift from evidence into indicator, the fact as you described a lack of access to technology as a result of Zakar and religious observance, using these very specific facts in order to justify rape denial. And this kind of operates in conjunction with, as I think you put so brilliantly, the contradiction between an overwhelming amount of evidence and perhaps that lack of very specialist documentation. So the idea that the images of Shani Luke, for example, burned in our memories, I'm sure, forever, were circulating and became almost ubiquitous, and yet these accounts have still been denied. So I would love to hear more from your perspective about that relationship between the overwhelming amount of evidence on the one hand and a persistent denial or rejection in the face of such important work that you're conducting as well.
I think, Chloe? Yeah, first of all, fascinating. We have to talk privately later on, but I think that the denialism is of those who would deny anything. So, like, I understand the zeal to deal with these people, but I'm trying to, let go of these obsessed anti-Semites and just relate to the majority of the people who are drawn to these denial practices and propaganda because they don't have anything else to cling to. So I feel that if you don't, use your energy to fight with these vicious idiots, then you can concentrate on being very professional and just, repeatedly explain the systematic manner in which and we don't have overwhelming, amount of evidence to what we claim that has happened, as opposed to more incidents of systematic rape. So if this is the case, I think it's going to be more helpful and productive not to allow them to draw all your attention and to create frustration in you and loss of belief in your ability to maintain a professional answer to that. So this is one thing, and the other is that I think that I think I lost the other point. Yes, maybe I'll remember later on.
So Amy.
Just a comment about land for day. The way that rape is used is to induce us to leave and not return. Because even for those few who survive, who the hell wants to go back? I wanted to get back to your main point in answering Chloe. Your distinction between indicators and evidence is absolutely crucial. I was wondering how we could use that outside of the realm that you're focused on, if it's possible, in terms of sexual violence in general, in the absence of, quote, terror. I was wondering if you could comment further on that.
Yeah, so Chloe, I recalled. The second thing is that I think we should admit to the fact that there is exacerbation, that people's imagination goes farther with trauma, and that there are those who take advantage of the drama, of the real drama, and want to draw attention to themselves. And we've seen some of these cases. I was very, very, very diligent and careful with every word I said in the beginning, because I thought that everything is as horrific as could be as it is. Like, we don't need to exaggerate. But on the other hand, I know that, some of the Zaka volunteers, like, they lost their minds in a way. And we know from regular cases of extreme sexual trauma that you are unable to bring in a coherent story, right? So I was very tolerant to that, and I said, yes, you are right. There are these type of accounts, and I know to differentiate those who are relevant from those who are not. And that does not imply that this has not happened. And we know this from regular cases of sexual violence. So this is something that we can do. And I think that some of the tools, recommendation for usage of tools that we brought in the report are meant exactly to prevent the ability of such, urban legends of babies cooking in the 40 babies beheaded and cooked in the oven to be brought to the fore. It's enough with what has happened in reality. Okay, so I think it's, in a way, that's an answer to what you said. So I always go back to my prior experience with fighting violence against women in softer tools than the strict and regular ones of criminal law. So this is my expertise. You know, at the beginning as a woman, of course, I asked myself, I questioned my potential contribution to what has happened. I was like, nothing prepared me to what has happened here. How am I qualified to even try and you know, contend that this is something that I should have my hands on and address so powerfully. But then the one thing was that there weren't many others. We were very few of us who did that. And secondly, I always, you know, I just had to calm myself and say, Yifat, there's no chance that what happened here, regardless of how unprecedented it was, is not related to what you know so well, for what you've been working on for over 20 years now, for, you know, regarding sexual violence. It will be different, but definitely relying on patterns and things that we've seen in the past. And that was when, later on, when I worked you know, on the report, I thought that this work should be also instrumental when we get back to normal and to our previous fights, in taking from it lessons and bring it to protect women's rights better.
My question really also kind of follows Amy's, but first of all, thank you for doing this work. Thank you for the report. And where can we find the report? That's another question. But my main question is, you know, thinking about how, in general, women and girls who are victims of sexual violence, usually it's boys and men they know. It's not usually an outside terror group that comes and does an attack. And there are many ways in which these different versions of sexual violence crimes, well, they're different, and sometimes one is worse, and sometimes, so aside from all of that, I'm not valuing any of that. But my question is, you know, this particular event, not just in Israel, but certainly in the Jewish world, it was like a recentering of sexual violence as an act of pure evil. And anyone who was talking about, anyone who cared about what happened in Israel on October 7th and who learned about the sexual violence was able to identify it as such. But it doesn't mean that those same people are able to look at everyday rape and sexual violence and incest and as the same kind of evil. And I'm wondering, and we even see with Mia Shem when she came back after, yeah, this was like a real example of the different responses that she got on social media in Israel, and certainly outside of Israel as well. Yeah, so this is my question is, do you see, and it's really relevant to anyone who's Israeli, but also us in the Jewish community outside of Israel, do we see this horrific event as a way of transforming our understandings? Yeah.
No. This is the short answer. The longer one is, like, I think there are two components to this query that you were raising. First of all, I felt responsible to not allowing others to abuse the case that we've been bringing forward as a means to justify something that is not in line with humanitarian law, you know, like obsessive male revenge now because of what they did to our women and stuff like this. So this topic, my fear as a feminist and my worry, and I had to take care of that, was that this same weaponization of women's body will be now weaponized in a way for goals that are not necessarily working for the benefit of those who were the victims. This is one thing, and in that in that regard, by the way, I had to sometimes I found myself fighting with radical left feminists in Israel, who used to be my allies, on this, claiming that I am now serving as a tool at the hands of a, extreme right, militant government members to justify their revenge, enhancement of their revenge, or whatever it is. I just couldn't believe it. And then I said, so you are now weaponizing the weaponization of women. Enough with it. So that was one side of the problematic, setting, and the other was, as you said, that those who were, taking my report with them and look at what she wrote, and I fought for women's right not to be sexually assaulted and to have the basic fair response of the state in their favor and protecting them against sexual violence for over 2 decades. What have you done for these women before that was the case? Suddenly you care about these women. So this was something that I was pushing forward. So if you care so much about these women, let me tell you something, that triggering of those who were previously sexually assaulted is something that the state now needs to address. So I was able to do that by just, saying that up front, saying I will not, and of course there is an abuse of that by all kinds of parties, but this is something that we've been used to as feminists throughout our professional work, to see how it's being used, but also abused sometimes, and this is not something that's gonna, deter me from completing this mission regardless.
Okay, thank you. Professor Yakira, final question.
Okay, I should be brief. First, a remark about denialism. I worked a little bit on Holocaust denial, and I think there are interesting phenomenological parallels between the two, the kind of denialism you talked about and the other one, and there are lessons to learn. So this is on. Second question is, have you reached some idea about the extent of the crimes? Do you know, like numbers? And the third one, completely different, you hinted about it. There were allegations about sexual crimes committed by Israelis. Do you have any confirmation of these, or can you refute it, or any other clarification of this?
Okay, so I'll start with the Holocaust. The first thing I think that is very interesting about denialism in the Holocaust, we have a lot to learn of the denialism there, but also about the inner denialism of what happened to many Jewish women from the sexual point of view. So there is almost no mentioning of that in the collective memory of the Holocaust, right? Of how Jewish women were sexually abused, and they were, tremendously abused, and we have very little knowledge about that. So this is one thing. The second thing about the numbers, I'm not part of the investigative team, and I'm being very careful in what I say due to that, and like if I can provide some kind of gross number given the you know, the knowledge that I've accumulated throughout the year and a half that I've been working on this subject, we're talking about tens of cases, something ranging between 30 to 60. Okay, these are like crazy numbers, given the fact that we're talking about such a short term of time that there was an ability to pursue these crimes, and this is definitely both expansive and systematic. As to your third remark, what was it? About the allegations against Israelis. What I have to say in this respect is that the, you know, continuous inquiries into these, into the question of whether such type of crimes were committed against Palestinians by soldiers, mainly by soldiers, both in Israel and outside of Israel, were interrogated not just by Israel, but rather by international bodies. There is no known evidence of anything that can somehow be looked at as systematic or expanded. And we know that there are incidents here and there, as there are, unfortunately, everywhere. And what is most important in my eyes is that you have a legal system that is an independent, professional, liberal, human rights protecting legal system, regardless of how imperfect it is to both Jewish women and Palestinian women in that respect, that has been convicting in the past soldiers and security, national security personnel in committing such crimes. So we have a functioning legal system. And in this respect, does it canvass all the cases? Probably not. Is there any evidence that this is something that is expansive and systematic? Nothing whatsoever. And this is where we're at. In that respect, I think we're not very different from the, you know, the commonly used contention of feminists that we are not, the legal system is not canvassing and not covering all of the cases of sexual violence perpetrated against women and girls and young boys. Maybe 10% of it is being brought to justice. So you know, knowing this, I can sleep at night. When the Palestinian Authority show me like one case in which such a criminal offense has been brought to their courts against someone who's done it on this, under this circumstance, we'll start talking about these comparisons.
So Yifat, on that note, thank you for your work, your leadership, and you do it with passion, but serious professionalism, and you're really a leading voice on really important issues, so thank you. Thanks. So.